It all started as a joke. Darren Collins, a 35-year-old graphic designer from Denver, was out with his best friend Liam on a frigid Thursday evening. The two had been searching for a late-night coffee shop when Liam spotted a neon sign blinking, Madame Esmeralda's Emporium of Mysteries. Fortunes told, secrets revealed. The sign was garish, the colors clashing in a way that hurt Darren's designer sensibilities, but Liam's eyes lit up. "You've got to try it," Liam said with a wide grin. "Come on, man. When else are you going to see a psychic?" Darren chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I'll survive not knowing if Mercury's in retrograde." But Liam was persistent. "Don't be boring. It'll be fun. Besides, you need to loosen up. Claire's probably at home watching her baking shows. Live a little." Darren hesitated. He wasn't particularly superstitious, and the idea of consulting a psychic seemed ridiculous. But Liam's enthusiasm was contagious, and there was something strangely magnetic about the flickering sign and the promise of peeking into the unknown. Before he knew it, Darren was following Liam through the door. The interior was as kitschy as he'd imagined. Strings of beads hung in the doorways, catching the dim light of red and purple bulbs. The smell of incense and patchouli wafted through the air, mingling with a faint undertone of wax. Shelves were lined with an odd assortment of objects: crystal balls, dusty books with illegible titles, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. Darren wasn't sure if he felt intrigued or mildly repulsed. "Welcome," a low, theatrical voice said, startling them. A petite woman stepped out from behind a curtain. She was dressed in layers of velvet and silk, her fingers adorned with rings that caught the dim light. Her dark eyes seemed to see right through Darren, and he shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "I am Madame Esmeralda," she said, gesturing dramatically to the room around her. "What brings you here tonight? Curiosity? Destiny? Or perhaps a question burning in your soul?" "Curiosity," Darren said quickly before Liam could concoct some ridiculous story. "We were just passing by and thought it might be fun." "Fun," Esmeralda repeated, arching an eyebrow. "The future is rarely fun, my dear. It is a path riddled with mysteries and warnings. But if you wish to glimpse it, I can oblige." She turned and swept into another room, the beads jingling as she passed through. "Follow me." Darren shot Liam a glance. "You owe me coffee for this." The next room was small and dimly lit, with a round table draped in a rich purple cloth. A crystal ball sat in the center, surrounded by an array of tarot cards. Esmeralda gestured for Darren to sit, and Liam leaned against the wall smirking. "Place your hands on the table," she instructed. Darren did as he was told, feeling increasingly ridiculous. Esmeralda closed her eyes and began humming softly, her hands hovering over the crystal ball. After a moment, she opened her eyes and stared directly at him. "You are a man of routine," she said. "You value order, stability, and loyalty. But there is a shadow on your path, a truth hidden in plain sight. Betrayal lurks in the heart of someone you trust deeply." Darren's eyebrows shot up. "Betrayal?" he repeated. "From who?" Esmeralda tilted her head, her gaze unflinching. "That is for you to discover. But know this: betrayal is not always what it seems. The truth will come in layers, and when it is revealed, it will test your very foundation." Liam snorted from his corner. "She's good. That's cryptic enough to apply to anyone." Darren tried to play along, but the word betrayal echoed in his mind. It felt too pointed, too sharp to be random. He laughed awkwardly. "Right. Thanks for the warning." Esmeralda's eyes never left his. "Dismiss it if you like, but the future is already in motion. Trust your instincts when the time comes." Darren left the shop feeling equal parts amused and uneasy. He told himself it was all nonsense, a performance designed to spook gullible people. But that night, as he climbed into bed beside Claire, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone, he couldn't shake the nagging sense of foreboding. He studied her for a moment, her golden hair tucked behind her ears, the faint crease of concentration on her brow as she scrolled through a recipe blog. Everything about her felt familiar, safe, but the psychic's words lingered like smoke. Betrayal lurks in the heart of someone you trust deeply. Shaking his head, Darren pushed the thought away. It was just a silly stunt, a momentary lapse in judgment. He kissed Claire on the cheek, muttering a good night, and closed his eyes. If there was one thing he knew for sure, it was that his wife would never betray him. At least that's what he thought. The next morning began like any other. Darren's alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., and he groggily rolled out of bed. Claire was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she brewed coffee. The smell of toasted bread wafted through the air, and the clatter of plates told him she was setting the table. It was their routine, predictable, comforting, unchanging. He shuffled into the kitchen, still shaking off the remnants of sleep. Claire turned, flashing him a smile that lit up her face. Her golden hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and she wore an oversized sweater that hung just past her hips. She looked as serene and radiant as ever, and Darren felt foolish for letting the psychic's words linger in his mind. "Morning, sleepyhead," Claire said, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs and toast across the table. "Busy day ahead?" "Not too bad," Darren replied, taking a sip of coffee. He watched her move around the kitchen, her movements precise and graceful. It was easy to forget how much effort Claire put into keeping their lives running smoothly. Work, home, everything in between. He felt a pang of guilt for even entertaining the psychic's cryptic warning. As the day wore on, the routine unfolded as usual. Darren spent the morning designing a new website for a local client, answering emails and dealing with the occasional frustrating feedback. By lunchtime, he'd almost forgotten about Madame Esmeralda altogether. But that evening, something strange happened. Claire had a book club meeting, a standing engagement every second Friday of the month. Normally, Darren barely noticed her absence. He'd order takeout, catch up on some gaming, and unwind. But as the clock struck 9, he found himself checking his phone more than usual. He couldn't pinpoint why, but something felt off. By 10, she still wasn't home. Darren frowned. Claire was never late, and if something had come up, she would have texted. He sent her a message. "Hey, everything okay?" A few minutes later, her reply buzzed through. "Sorry, lost track of time. Wrapping up soon." Darren exhaled, chastising himself for worrying. He distracted himself with a Netflix documentary until he heard the sound of her keys in the door around 11. She walked in, cheeks flushed from the cold, holding a Tupperware container of leftover snacks. "Sorry I'm late," she said, leaning in to kiss his cheek. Her lips were cool, and he caught the faint scent of wine. "Jenna brought this amazing charcuterie board, and we all got carried away talking about the book." Darren nodded, but a tiny voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Something's not right." The following week, that voice grew louder. Claire's schedule seemed more erratic than usual. She started taking her phone with her everywhere, even to the bathroom, which she'd never done before. She laughed at texts she wouldn't share, dismissing them as silly work stuff. Darren told himself he was being paranoid. People have private moments, he reasoned. It didn't mean anything. But then came Saturday night. Claire announced she was meeting her coworker Emily for dinner. "She's been going through a rough patch," Claire explained as she applied a soft pink lipstick in the bathroom mirror. "I want to be there for her." Darren nodded, watching her reflection. "Want me to come? I like Emily." Claire waved him off with a laugh. "It's a girl thing, babe. We're going to vent about work and eat too much dessert. You'd be bored out of your mind." She left at 7, leaving Darren alone with his thoughts. The unease gnawed at him, growing sharper with every passing minute. It wasn't that Claire had done anything overtly suspicious. It was the small things, the extra care in her appearance, the way she guarded her phone, the sudden irregularities in her otherwise predictable schedule. At 8:30, Darren's phone buzzed. It was Liam. "Hey, want to grab a beer?" Liam asked. "I'm at this new place downtown." Darren hesitated, glancing at the clock. He was tempted to stay home and stew, but Liam's voice had a way of pulling him out of his head. "Sure," he said. "I'll meet you there." The bar was noisy and crowded, with a live band playing blues in the corner. Darren found Liam at a high-top table near the back, nursing a pale ale. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Liam said, raising an eyebrow. Darren shrugged. Just, stuff on my mind. Claire's been acting weird." Liam smirked. "Weird how?" "I don't know. Like she's hiding something," Darren admitted. "She's out with Emily tonight, but I can't shake this feeling that something's off." Liam leaned back, taking a long sip of his beer. "Man, you're overthinking it. Claire's as solid as they come. Don't let that psychic nonsense mess with your head. Darren wanted to believe him, but as he drove home later that night, a flicker of doubt lingered. The streets were quiet, bathed in the glow of streetlights. When he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Claire's car already parked. Inside, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room TV. Claire was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching a rom-com. She turned when he entered, her face lighting up. "Hey, how was your night?" she asked, her voice warm and genuine. Darren forced a smile. "Good. How was dinner with Emily?" "Great," she said without hesitation. "We laughed a lot. She really needed it." And yet, as Darren sat beside her, the psychic's words echoed in his mind. Betrayal lurks in the heart of someone you trust deeply. He wanted to brush it off, but the cracks in their routine had already started to form, and he couldn't stop himself from peering into them. The following week passed in a haze of half-smiles and restless thoughts. Darren tried to convince himself he was imagining things, but his unease only grew. Claire was still the same loving, supportive partner she had always been, or at least she seemed to be, but her actions had taken on a subtle, dissonant quality, like a song played slightly off-key. Darren's unease reached its peak on Wednesday night. Claire had just stepped out of the shower, a cloud of steam following her into the bedroom. She toweled her hair dry while humming an old Fleetwood Mac tune, her reflection visible in the mirror. It was such a normal moment, but Darren couldn't shake the feeling that her life had split into two tracks, the one he saw and the one she kept hidden. He decided to confide in Liam again during their usual Thursday lunch. The cafe was noisy, but Darren's voice was hushed, his words hurried. "I can't shake it, Liam," Darren admitted. "It's like she's, I don't know, hiding something. I know it sounds paranoid." Liam chewed his sandwich thoughtfully before responding. "Look, you've been together for what, 10 years? Claire's always been rock solid. Maybe she's stressed or going through something she doesn't know how to share. People aren't perfect." "Yeah, maybe," Darren said, but the explanation felt too simple. "It's just these little things. Her phone, the late nights, the excuses. It's not like her." Liam shrugged. "If you're that worried, talk to her. Communication solves everything, man." Darren nodded but didn't feel reassured. Talking to Claire felt like trying to unearth something fragile, a truth that might shatter if he pushed too hard. That night, Darren decided to let his instincts guide him. He waited until Claire had fallen asleep, her soft breathing filling the dark room. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he reached for her phone on the nightstand. The act felt invasive, wrong, but the nagging suspicion outweighed his guilt. Claire's phone was locked, but Darren had watched her enter the passcode countless times. His fingers hesitated over the screen, trembling slightly. Then he entered her code, 0721, her birth date. The phone unlocked with a soft click. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, unsure of where to start. Her messages seemed innocent enough, filled with mundane exchanges about work and plans with friends. But as he scrolled further, something caught his eye, a thread with someone named S. The messages weren't overtly incriminating, but they had an intimacy that made Darren's stomach twist. "Thanks for tonight. I really needed that." "You're amazing. Always know that." "When can I see you again?" His hands went cold. The timestamps didn't align with her book club meeting or dinner with Emily. His heart raced as he pieced together a timeline that didn't fit the narrative Claire had given him. Darren put the phone back, his mind reeling. Who was S? A co-worker? An old friend? He couldn't bring himself to jump to conclusions, but the psychic's words rang louder than ever. Betrayal lurks in the heart of someone you trust deeply. The next day, Darren couldn't focus on work. He replayed everything in his mind. The cryptic messages, Claire's sudden change in behavior, the psychic's ominous warning. He debated confronting her but feared overreacting. What if he was wrong? What if there was a perfectly reasonable explanation? That evening, Claire was unusually cheerful, chatting animatedly about her day as she cooked dinner. Darren watched her, searching for cracks in her facade, but she seemed perfectly at ease. It made him feel like he was losing his grip on reality. "How's Emily?" he asked casually, testing the waters. Claire paused, glancing over her shoulder. Emily. Oh, she's good. We've been texting a lot lately. She's going through a breakup, poor thing. Darren nodded, his jaw tightening. He couldn't tell if her answer was genuine or calculated. The uncertainty was maddening. 2 days later, Darren's suspicions reached a breaking point. He left work early, unable to focus, and decided to clear his head with a walk downtown. As he passed a wine bar Claire had mentioned once, he froze. Through the window, he saw her. Claire was sitting at a corner table, laughing with a man Darren didn't recognize. She leaned forward slightly, her posture relaxed, her expression warm. The man, dark-haired, well-dressed and confident, smiled back, his hand resting on the table between them. Darren couldn't see if their hands touched, but the scene felt intimate, unmistakably personal. His stomach churned. For a moment, he considered storming in, demanding an explanation, but instead he stepped back into the shadows, his heart pounding as he watched them. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to confront her, but a quiet, insidious voice whispered, "Wait, watch, see what unfolds." Claire and the man eventually stood to leave, exiting the bar together. Darren followed at a safe distance, his breath fogging in the cold air. They walked to a nearby park, their silhouettes visible under the dim glow of street lamps. Claire's laughter carried on the wind, a sound that now felt foreign to him. Then something unexpected happened. They stopped near a bench, and the man pulled a small envelope from his coat. He handed it to Claire, who hesitated before taking it. Darren couldn't hear their words, but her body language shifted. Tense, conflicted. After a moment, she turned and walked away, leaving the man standing alone. Darren's mind raced. This wasn't an affair. It was something else, something even more perplexing. As Claire disappeared into the night, the psychic's warning loomed larger than ever. The truth will come in layers, and when it is revealed, it will test your very foundation. Darren realized he hadn't uncovered the betrayal yet. He had only peeled back the first layer. Darren barely slept that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts churning like a storm. The vision of Claire in the wine bar with the mysterious man played on a loop in his mind, each repetition raising more questions. Who was he? What was in the envelope? And why did Claire look so conflicted? The next morning, Darren's unease turned into resolve. He needed answers. If he approached Claire directly, she'd likely have an explanation ready. But something deep inside him whispered that the truth was more complicated than a simple conversation could uncover. After Claire left for work, Darren sat in the living room, clutching his coffee mug as if it could steady him. He pulled out his laptop and began searching. He started with Claire's social media, scrolling through her posts and tagged photos. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Vacation pictures, family gatherings, and snapshots of their cozy home life. But then he noticed something subtle, a pattern of comments from an account he didn't recognize. The account belonged to someone named Simon Reeves. Darren clicked through to Simon's profile, only to find it mostly private. The few public posts were innocuous, a couple of professional-looking photos and a pinned link to a charity website. Darren frowned. Simon wasn't listed among Claire's friends, but his comments appeared on several of her posts over the past year. They were friendly, even flirtatious at times, though Claire's replies were always polite and neutral. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. Darren followed it. That evening, Claire came home with takeout. She greeted Darren with a kiss on the cheek, her usual warmth intact. But Darren couldn't help scrutinizing her every move. She set the table, chatting about her day as if nothing had happened. Darren struggled to match her tone, his stomach churning. "Busy at work?" he asked casually, spearing a piece of chicken with his fork. "Non-stop," Claire replied, rolling her eyes. "It's like everyone forgot how to use email today. I've been running in circles." Darren nodded, biting back the urge to confront her. Instead, he leaned into his suspicions. "I drove past that wine bar downtown yesterday. Made me think of you. Didn't you say you went there with Emily once?" Claire's fork paused mid-air, just for a fraction of a second, before she continued eating. "Oh yeah, ages ago. It's a nice spot. Maybe we should go sometime," Darren said, watching her closely. Her face remained calm, her smile easy, but her eyes flickered with something he couldn't place. "Sure," she said, "whenever you want." The conversation moved on, but Darren's unease grew. That tiny hesitation, that flicker, it was enough to convince him. Claire was hiding something. The next day, Darren's resolve hardened. He decided to dig deeper. He couldn't shake the image of the envelope the man, Simon, he assumed, had handed her. What was in it? He needed to know. While Claire was at work, Darren searched their home. He felt a pang of guilt as he rifled through drawers and closets, but the thought of betrayal outweighed his hesitation. He found nothing unusual until he checked Claire's work bag. Tucked inside was the envelope. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. Darren's breath caught as he read, "Claire, time is running out. You need to make a decision. We can't keep this up. It's not fair to either of us. Call me when you're ready." Simon Darren stared at the note, his mind racing. What couldn't they keep up? What decision was she being forced to make? His chest tightened as the weight of the unknown pressed down on him. That night, Darren's tension boiled over. Claire noticed his quiet demeanor during dinner and finally asked, "Is everything okay? You seem off." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I've just been stressed about work, deadlines piling up." Claire nodded sympathetically, reaching for his hand. "You should take a break. Maybe we can plan a weekend away." Her touch was warm, her concern genuine, or at least it seemed so. Darren wanted to believe her, but the note burned in his mind. He couldn't confront her yet, not until he had the full picture. The next few days passed in a haze of unease. Darren felt like a stranger in his own home, tiptoeing around Claire as he tried to piece together the puzzle. He decided to track Simon down, desperate for clarity. It wasn't hard to find him. A quick search of the charity website linked to his profile revealed that Simon was the director of a local nonprofit. Darren drove past the address after work one evening, his pulse racing. The building was a modest office space with a simple sign out front, Bright Futures Foundation. Darren parked down the street and waited, unsure of what he was hoping to see. Just as he was about to give up, the front door opened. Simon stepped out, locking the door behind him. He looked exactly as Darren remembered from the wine bar, tall, confident, and well-dressed. Darren's grip on the steering wheel tightened as Simon walked to his car. For a brief moment, Darren considered approaching him, but he stopped himself. He needed more information before making his move. That night, Darren's thoughts spiraled. He felt trapped, torn between his love for Claire and the growing mountain of evidence that something was amiss. The note, the messages, the meeting with Simon, everything pointed to a betrayal. But was it the kind the psychic had warned him about, or was he misinterpreting the signs? As he lay awake beside Claire, her steady breathing the only sound in the room, Darren realized he was at a crossroads. He could confront her now, demand answers, and risk shattering their life together. Or he could dig deeper, uncover the full truth, and face whatever came next. He thought of Madame Esmeralda's words, "The truth will come in layers." Darren wasn't ready for the final layer yet, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Something was coming, and it would test everything he thought he knew about Claire and himself. The morning came with a sense of purpose, but it was tainted by Darren's growing exhaustion. He had spent too many nights wrestling with questions that had no answers, and now he found himself moving through the day like a ghost in his own life. Claire noticed his distraction, but she didn't press him. If anything, her cheerfulness seemed forced, as if she, too, was trying to hold something together. By lunchtime, Darren had decided he needed to speak with Simon. The thought of confronting Claire filled him with dread. He couldn't bear the possibility of hearing her lie to him. If Simon had answers, Darren wanted to hear them first. The Bright Futures Foundation office was quiet when Darren arrived in the early afternoon. He parked across the street, his palms slick against the steering wheel. For several minutes, he debated whether he was making a mistake. What if Simon had no connection to Claire beyond a professional one? What if Darren was about to embarrass himself by storming into a stranger's workplace with wild accusations? But the note in the envelope told a different story. Claire's name had been there, clear and undeniable. And Simon's tone, urgent, pleading, suggested an intimacy Darren couldn't ignore. He took a deep breath, climbed out of the car, and crossed the street. Inside the office, a young receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "Hi," Darren said, doing his best to sound casual. "I'm looking for Simon Reeves. Is he available?" The receptionist glanced at her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's personal. It'll only take a minute." She hesitated, then picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, she gestured toward a door at the end of the hallway. "He's free for a few minutes. You can go on back." Darren nodded, his heart pounding as he approached the door. He knocked lightly, and Simon's voice called out, "Come in." The office was modest, with shelves of books and framed photos of charity events lining the walls. Simon sat behind a desk, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression calm but curious. He stood as Darren entered, extending a hand. "Hi there, I'm Simon. What can I do for you?" Darren ignored the handshake. "We need to talk about Claire." Simon froze, his hand dropping to his side. For a brief moment, his expression shifted, shock, maybe even guilt, before he recovered. "I'm sorry. I don't think I understand." "You do," Darren said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I saw you with her at the wine bar. I know you gave her that note. I want to know what's going on." Simon's eyes narrowed, and he gestured toward the chair in front of his desk. "Sit down, Darren." The use of his name made Darren hesitate. How did Simon know who he was? He sat reluctantly, his fists clenched on his lap. Simon sighed, leaning forward. "Look, I'm not sure how much you know, but I'll tell you the truth because Claire deserves better than half-truths. I've been working with her for the past few months, off the books." "Working with her?" Darren echoed, his confusion mounting. Simon nodded. "Claire came to me because of something from her past, something she's been trying to make right." Darren's stomach tightened. "What past? What are you talking about?" Simon hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Years ago, before she met you, Claire was involved in a situation that spiraled out of control. I don't know all the details, but it involved someone she trusted taking advantage of her kindness. She ended up signing documents that, let's just say, they weren't exactly ethical. It's not her fault, but she's been living with the consequences ever since." "What kind of consequences?" Darren asked, his voice rising. "The kind that could ruin her career," Simon said bluntly. "The people she got tangled up with resurfaced recently. They've been pressuring her, threatening to go public if she doesn't cooperate." Darren's mind raced. This wasn't what he expected. An affair, maybe, but not this. "Why didn't she tell me?" Simon leaned back, his expression softening. "Because she loves you. She didn't want you to know about this part of her life. She's ashamed even though she shouldn't be. She asked me for help because I have experience with these kinds of situations. I've been helping her navigate the legal mess and deal with the people involved." "And the note?" Darren asked. "What decision was she supposed to make?" Simon hesitated again. "Claire needs to decide whether to come clean to the authorities or try to settle quietly. Either way, it's going to cost her, financially, emotionally, and maybe even her reputation. She's been struggling to figure out the right thing to do." Darren sat in stunned silence. The psychic's warning echoed in his mind. Betrayal lurks in the heart of someone you trust deeply. This wasn't the betrayal he had envisioned. Claire hadn't betrayed him out of malice or deceit. She had been protecting him from a truth she couldn't bear to share. That night, Darren watched Claire more closely than ever. She moved around the kitchen, her face serene but tired, as if she carried a weight he had never noticed before. He wanted to confront her, to tell her he knew, but he hesitated. He needed to process everything Simon had told him. When Claire finally sat beside him on the couch, resting her head on his shoulder, Darren felt a pang of guilt. She had been fighting a battle he hadn't even known existed, and he had doubted her. As the credits of their show rolled, Claire turned to him with a soft smile. "You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" Darren met her gaze, his chest tightening. He thought of all the moments he had questioned her, the times he had let suspicion cloud his love. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice steady. "Everything's fine." But he knew the truth was far from fine. The betrayal he had uncovered wasn't hers. It was his own. He had failed to trust her, to see the pain she had hidden for his sake, and now he needed to figure out how to rebuild what had quietly fractured between them. Darren couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, Simon's words replayed in his mind. Claire's secret wasn't a betrayal in the way he'd feared. It was a burden she had chosen to carry alone. Yet the fact that she hadn't shared it with him cut deep. Their marriage was built on trust, or so he'd believed. Now he was left questioning not her love, but his role in the life she had worked so hard to protect. The next morning, Darren woke to find Claire already up, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid, and she wore the soft, worn cardigan he loved. She looked peaceful, but there was a tension in her posture that he hadn't noticed before. It was as if she were bracing for something she couldn't control. "Morning," she said, smiling warmly as he joined her. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," Darren replied, sitting across from her. He wrapped his hands around his mug, the warmth steadying him. "Claire, we need to talk." Her smile faltered, and she set her cup down. "What's wrong?" Darren hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had thought about how to approach this all night, but now that the time had come, words failed him. Finally, he decided to lead with honesty. "I know about Simon," he said softly. "I know about the wine bar, the note, and everything else." Claire froze, her eyes widening in shock. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then her shoulders sagged. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter how," Darren interrupted gently. "What matters is that you didn't tell me. Why, Claire? Why would you go through all of this alone?" She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I was scared. Scared of what you'd think of me. Scared of dragging you into something messy and ugly, when you've always been my safe place." "Claire," Darren said, leaning forward, "you don't have to protect me from your past. We're supposed to face things together. That's what marriage is about." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for his hand. "I know. But it felt different. I thought if I could just handle it on my own, it wouldn't have to touch us." "But it has," Darren said firmly. "It's touched us in ways you don't even realize. I've spent weeks doubting you, doubting myself, because I knew something was wrong, and you wouldn't let me in." The tears spilled over, and Claire squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "I know," Darren said, his voice softening. "But we can't keep secrets like this. Not if we're going to move forward." Claire nodded, wiping her cheeks. "You're right. You deserve to know everything." Over the next hour, Claire told Darren the full story. Years ago, fresh out of college and desperate for a foothold in the professional world, she had taken a job at a small marketing firm. The firm's owner, a charming but manipulative man named Richard, had convinced her to sign off on contracts that turned out to be fraudulent. When the scheme collapsed, Richard disappeared, leaving Claire and a handful of other employees to face the fallout. Though she wasn't charged with any crimes, her involvement had left a stain on her professional record. When Richard resurfaced recently, he began pressuring her to help him again, this time using threats to expose her past if she refused. "That's when I found Simon," Claire explained, her voice trembling. "He's been helping me figure out how to handle this legally without destroying everything I've built." Darren listened quietly, his heart breaking for her. He could see the toll this had taken, the sleepless nights, the forced smiles, the weight she carried in silence. And he hated that he had spent weeks doubting her instead of seeing the pain she was in. "What do you want to do now?" Darren asked when she finished. Claire looked at him, her eyes red but resolute. "I want to go to the authorities. I'm done letting Richard control me, and I'm done hiding things from you." Darren reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Then that's what we'll do, together." The days that followed were a whirlwind. With Simon's guidance, Claire filed a report against Richard, detailing her past involvement in the recent threats. It was a nerve-wracking process, but Darren stayed by her side every step of the way. For the first time in weeks, they felt like a team again. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Claire turned to Darren with a tentative smile. "You must think I'm a mess." Darren shook his head. "I think you're the bravest person I know. You've been through hell, and you still came out fighting." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," Darren promised, wrapping his arm around her. Weeks later, as the legal proceedings against Richard began to unfold, Darren found himself reflecting on everything they had been through. The psychic's warning still lingered in his mind, Betrayal lurks in the heart of someone you trust deeply. In the end, it hadn't been Claire's betrayal that had tested their marriage. It had been his own doubts, his failure to trust her when it mattered most. But the warning hadn't been entirely wrong. The betrayal had come, just not in the way he'd expected. It was a betrayal of assumptions, of communication, of the idea that love alone was enough to navigate life's challenges. They had both learned that trust required more than faith. It required honesty, even when the truth was painful. As Darren kissed Claire goodnight and settled into bed, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. The layers of secrecy had been peeled away, and what remained was stronger, more resilient than ever. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. And this time, there would be no secrets.